"Tell me where she is," the commander said, "or I will burn this village to the ground and call it a training exercise." The man on the other side of the radio said nothing for 3 full seconds. Then, "She's already in position." Nobody had told her to go. That was the part that nobody could quite explain afterward. In the debrief, in the report, in the 6 separate inquiries that followed, Sergeant Vivienne Lacroix had not been ordered to move to the ridge. She had not been cleared to take a sniper position. She was a signals operator attached to a joint Canadian-American reconnaissance unit operating in a valley in northern Kandahar province, and her job, her actual, documented, authorized job, was to maintain radio contact and log grid coordinates. That was all. That was the entirety of what anyone had asked of her. But the sniper was down, and the Taliban commander was still alive, and 7 people were about to die. What happens in the space between a standing order and an impossible moment is not something they teach you in any training manual. The Canadian forces have excellent training manuals. Lacroix had read most of them. None of them had a chapter for this. She had grown up in Chicoutimi, in the Saguenay region of Quebec, in a house that backed onto a long stretch of boreal forest, where her father hunted moose every October, with the focused patience of a man who believed that waiting was its own form of action. He had a saying, not an original one, she later discovered, but she had believed for years that it belonged only to him, that the rifle does not know what it is pointed at. Only the person behind it does. She used to roll her eyes at that. She was 17, and she rolled her eyes at most things her father said. Later, she would think about it often. Vivienne had been a mathematics student before she was a soldier. She had spent 2 years at the Université du Québec à Chicoutimi studying applied mathematics, with a focus on fluid dynamics, which was an area of study that had very little to do with what she would eventually do for a living, and everything to do with how her mind processed the physical world. She understood at a cellular level the behavior of moving systems, the way variables interact under pressure, the way small errors, compounded across distance, become catastrophic. She had left university not because she was failing, but because she was restless. That was the word her academic advisor had used in the exit interview, restless. He had meant it as a concern. She had taken it as a diagnosis. She enlisted at 22. She was trained as a communications specialist because she tested high-end pattern recognition, and because the forces needed signals operators, and because nobody, at any point in her intakes process, had thought to ask her what she could do with a rifle. This was an oversight. The unit had been in the valley for 11 days when the mission brief changed. The original objective had been purely observational, a reconnaissance sweep of a suspected supply corridor used by a local Taliban network to move materiel through the district. No engagement anticipated. Minimal footprint, in and out within 72 hours. That had been the brief, and like most briefs, it had survived contact with reality for approximately 48 hours before reality had other ideas. The intelligence that came in on day 9 changed everything. A senior Taliban commander, known in the reports by the designation Tariq, though whether this was a name or a rank or simply what the intelligence community had decided to call him, had moved his command post into a compound in the valley. This was not supposed to happen. His presence there was an opportunity that the upper chain of command decided, quickly and without much visible anguish, not to waste. The mission was extended. The objective was revised. The unit's 2-person sniper team, Warrant Officer Pemberton and his spotter, Corporal Sean Leahy, was tasked with the primary engagement. Lacroix's job remained unchanged. Signals, coordinates, radio traffic. She was fine with that. She had always been fine with that. The problem was Tariq. Tariq was patient in the way that men who have survived a long time in violent environments tend to be patient, not as a virtue, but as a reflex. He moved irregularly. He changed positions at intervals that corresponded to no predictable schedule. He did not stand near windows. He understood the geometry of his own exposure in the way that certain people understand it, only after they have survived being shot at enough times. Pemberton spent 2 days acquiring a firing solution and could not hold one for longer than 40 seconds before Tariq moved again. On the morning of the 3rd day, Lacroix was on the ridge adjusting an antenna relay when she heard the shot. It was not the sound of Pemberton firing. She knew that sound knew its direction, its weight, the way it cracked and then folded into the valley walls. This was different. This came from below. From the compound, she turned. Pemberton was down, not wounded, down in the way that required immediate medical attention and would not be getting it, because Leahy was already calling it in, and the nearest extraction point was 4 kilometers east, and the window for everything, for the mission, for the command structure's decision, for the lives of the 6 Canadian and 1 American Special Operations soldiers currently in exposed positions throughout the valley, was closing. She heard Leahy's voice on the radio, controlled but stripped of all decoration. Shooter is down. Repeat, primary shooter is down. Tariq is still active. He's moving to the north wall. If he reaches the command vehicle, we lose the entire intercept package and he burns the network. We have approximately 7 minutes. 7 minutes. In the debrief, Major Harlan Stovall, a careful man with careful eyes who had spent 22 years making careful decisions, would ask Lacroix to describe her thought process in the moment that followed. She would tell him, as plainly as she could, that there was not much thought involved. That is not to say there was no calculation. There was calculation. There was a great deal of it, compressed into a period of time that her memory would later refuse to render in any conventional sequence. What she knew, Tariq was moving toward the north wall. The compound was 847 meters away. There was a crosswind from the northwest at approximately 12 kilometers per hour, gusting. The temperature was 4 degrees Celsius. The altitude was roughly 1,100 meters above sea level. Pemberton's rifle was a C-14 Timberwolf, chambered in .338 Lapua Magnum. She had never fired a C-14 Timberwolf. She picked it up anyway. Leahy looked at her. He did not ask what she was doing. Later, he would say that he had known, the moment he saw her face, that the question was irrelevant. "Give me the spotter data," she said. Her voice, she would later be told by 3 separate people, was completely calm. She did not feel completely calm. What she felt was closer to the sensation she used to get during advanced mathematics examinations, a kind of crystalline narrowing, where everything outside the problem ceased to exist and the problem itself became the entire world. Leahy gave her the data: elevation, wind, range, the position Tariq had been moving toward, and the speed at which a man walks when he believes he is not being observed. Lacroix ran the numbers. This is not a metaphor. She actually ran the numbers, sequentially, in her head, in the way she had been trained to process information as a signals operator and the way she had been wired since childhood to process information as a person who finds comfort in the behavior of systems. Bullet drop at 847 meters with a .338 Lapua is predictable within tolerances that are well documented. Wind drift at 12 kilometers per hour across that distance is approximately 35 centimeters. The Coriolis effect at this latitude and this range is negligible but not zero. The target is moving at roughly 1.4 meters per second toward a doorway that he will reach in approximately 9 seconds from the moment she acquires him in the scope. She would need to lead him by just under 2 meters. She settled into the position Pemberton had been using. The bipod was already deployed. The scope was already zeroed. She found him. What happens in the human nervous system during a moment of acute, voluntary, morally weighted decision-making is not well understood, even by the scientists who study it most carefully. What the research does suggest is that the body tends to simplify in extremis, that the flood of competing signals, the noise of self-doubt and consequence and training and fear, tends to narrow, under sufficient pressure, into something very close to silence. Lacroix would describe it afterward as a kind of stillness that she had felt only twice before in her life. Once during a mathematics competition at 16, when she had seen the solution to a proof that everyone else in the room was still searching for, and once when she was 12 years old, standing in the boreal forest behind her parents' house, watching a moose emerge from the tree line at dawn. Both times she had simply known. She waited for Tariq to clear the doorframe. He did not hurry. He was a careful man, as she had been briefed. He paused at the threshold for a moment that was, in retrospect, the moment on which 7 lives turned. And then he stepped through. She exhaled. She broke the shock. The sound of a .338 Lapua Magnum in an enclosed valley is not something that leaves you quickly. Leahy described it later as a sound that seemed to arrive from everywhere at once, as though the valley itself had made a decision. The radio came alive immediately. She could hear Stovall's voice, Major Harlan Stovall, who was monitoring the operation from the forward operating base and who had, until approximately 4 seconds ago, been watching an operation collapse in real time, asking a question that nobody in the field needed to answer because the answer was already visible on the thermal imaging feed. Tariq was down. The compound went into immediate chaos, the kind of reactive, leaderless chaos that experienced military minds know to read as confirmation. The secondary elements, the fighters who had been positioned throughout the valley in coordination with the command structure, began to move without direction. The intercept package was intact. The extraction window had not yet closed. Leahy was on the radio within seconds. His voice still carried the particular flatness of someone who has not yet permitted themselves to process what they have just witnessed. "Target is down," he said. "I say again, target is down. Requesting immediate medical for Warrant Officer Pemberton and extraction for the full element." Then he looked at Lacroix. He looked at her for a long time. She had already set the rifle down and was moving toward Pemberton, because there was nothing else useful she could do with a rifle, and there were things that might be useful she could do for a wounded man. "Where did you learn that?" Leahy said. She didn't answer immediately. She was applying pressure to Pemberton's wound with the focused practicality of someone who has been trained to stay useful under pressure, which she had been. "I used to hunt moose," she said finally. Leahy made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Pemberton survived. This matters. The medical team reached him within the extraction window, and he was in surgery at the forward operating base within 2 hours. He lost partial function in his left hand, which ended his career as a sniper, which he would later describe in an interview with a Canadian Forces Veterans publication as the second most significant thing that happened to me that day. The first being that he was still alive to be interviewed at all. The debrief took 11 days. There were 6 inquiries of varying levels of formality, and Lacroix sat through all of them with the same quality of stillness that she had brought to the ridge. She answered every question. She volunteered information that had not been requested. She did not attempt to minimize or dramatize. Major Stovall was present for most of the formal sessions. He was, as has been noted, a careful man. He asked careful questions. He read the numbers she had run. She had written them out, at someone's request, on a whiteboard in the briefing room, the full chain of calculation from wind drift to lead distance, annotated, and he was quiet for a long time after. "You were a mathematics student," he said finally. "Briefly," she said. "Were you ever formally trained as a sniper?" "No." He looked at her for a moment, in the way that experienced commanding officers look at people who have just made them revise a set of assumptions they had held for a long time. "In 21 years of field operations," he said, "I have had the outcome of a mission depend entirely on the skill of one individual exactly 4 times. He paused. This was one of them. She did not respond. She had learned over the course of 11 days of debriefs that some statements are not questions, and that the best response to a statement that is not a question is to let it sit where it lands. "What do you want to do next?" he asked. It was the question she had not been expecting, not because it was surprising, but because nobody had asked her a question that simple in 11 days. She thought about the forest behind her parents' house. She thought about the moose at the tree line and the stillness she had felt watching it, and the patience her father had tried to teach her about waiting and knowing and the space between them. "I want to learn how to do this correctly," she said. She was transferred to the Canadian Forces Sniper Program 8 months later. She was the 3rd woman in the program's history. She finished first in her training cohort in long-range marksmanship, which surprised no one who had seen what she had done in Kandahar, and she finished first in the technical ballistics assessment, which surprised no one who had seen the whiteboard. She did not talk about the valley often. This was not because she was unwilling to talk about it, but because she had found, over time, that people tended to want the story to be simpler than it was. They wanted a moment of pure heroism, a single clear decision, uncomplicated by the weight of what had followed. They wanted the shot, not the silence afterward. What she carried was harder to explain than a shot. She had taken a life, She had taken it with full knowledge of what she was doing, and she had done it with the calm, mathematical precision of someone who understood the physical world as a system of variables. And it had saved 7 people, and she was certain, she had been certain from the moment the shot broke, that it was the correct decision, the right variable, the only solution to the problem as it had been given to her. And yet, there is a thing that happens when you are trained in mathematics, particularly in the applied kind, the kind that deals with systems and dynamics and the real behavior of real things in the real world. You learn that every system has a cost, not always a visible cost, not always a cost that appears on the ledger where you are looking, but a cost, always a cost. She had factored for wind, she had factored for distance and temperature and bullet drop and Coriolis, and the speed at which a careful man walks through a doorway. She had not factored for the weight of knowing that she had been right, because the weight of being right is not a variable that appears in any ballistics manual. It is not something that can be calculated in advance. You can only carry it. She was promoted to Master Corporal the following spring. She was recommended for a commendation that she asked, in writing, not to receive. The request was granted, which surprised her, and then it did not surprise her, because the forces, in her experience, were sometimes better at understanding the cost of things than they were given credit for. Leahy sent her a message on the anniversary of the operation. He sent it every year for the next 4 years, a short message, never more than 2 or 3 lines, that always said some version of the same thing, that he thought about the ridge often, and that he was glad she had been there, and that he hoped she was well. She always replied. Pemberton reached out once, about 2 years after the operation, to ask if he could speak with her directly. They met at a coffee shop in Ottawa, not far from the Rideau Canal, on a gray November morning that had the particular quality of Canadian November mornings, low and still, and carrying the smell of wet leaves and cold water. He ordered tea, which she had not expected. She ordered nothing, which she later thought was rude, and which she would have fixed if she had thought of it in time. He talked for a long time. He was a thoughtful man, she discovered, in a way that his service record had not quite prepared her for. He talked about his hand and his career, and the particular strangeness of owing your life to someone who had not been authorized to save it. I've thought a lot about what you did, he said. A lot of people have, she said. No. He shook his head slightly. I mean the decision, not the shot. The decision. She waited. You didn't have to, he said. You could have stayed on comms. You could have argued that it wasn't your call. You could have made a very reasonable case that it was outside your authorization and waited for someone else to figure it out. And in 7 minutes, that window would have closed, and whatever happened would have happened without you having decided anything. Yes, she said, but you didn't. No. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a cyclist went past on the canal path, a flash of color against the gray. Why, he asked. She thought about it. She gave him the honest answer, which was not the cleanest answer, and which she had never said out loud before. Because I could see it clearly, she said. The problem, all of it. The variables, the window, what it would cost to act and what it would cost not to act. I could see it the way you see a proof when it resolves, when everything that was uncertain becomes certain all at once. She paused. And once you can see something that clearly, not acting is also a choice. It's just a choice you make in the dark. Pemberton nodded. He held his tea in both hands, the left one slightly less steady than the right. Do you regret it? He said. She thought about the boreal forest, the moose at the tree line, the long patience of standing very still and knowing exactly where you are. No, she said, but I carry it. He nodded again, as though that was precisely the answer he had needed to hear. They sat for a while longer without speaking. The canal was silver and flat in the November light, and somewhere across the water, a dog was barking at something it couldn't reach. And Vivienne Lacroix, who had once solved an impossible problem on a ridge in Kandahar, with a rifle she had never fired and numbers she had run entirely in her head, drank her nothing and watched the water, and understood that some things, once carried, do not get lighter. They only get more familiar.